Are you ready for the hot seat?
Welcome to In the Hot Seat with the Tenney Group. I'm Spencer Tenney. It's good to be with you. You may think you know what's happening in the freight market right now, but my next guest will change your mind in minutes, overwhelming you with his many data models. With me, Jason Miller, the professor, Michigan State University's Eli Broad School of Business. Jason Miller, welcome to the hot seat, sir.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Spencer.
Well, before we heat things up a little bit, sir, just give us a little sense of the work that you're doing in the truckload space right now.
Yeah, so a lot of my academic research is specifically on the issue of motor carrier safety, compliance, as well as employment dynamics, so understanding carriers adding jobs, destroying jobs. And then I do a lot of industry outreach and engagement, especially on where's the market at, and trying to bring, in many instances, a sort of flavor of the different sort of government economic indicators, be it manufacturing, wholesaling, payroll data, to really try to have a more holistic conversation around things that maybe we didn't talk about as much a decade ago.
Well, very interesting. So let's jump right in there. Tariffs. Of all the many tariffs of Trump's administration, what would you say is your favorite?
So it depends on how we define favorite here right now. I think the ones to me that make the least sense, and there was just actually an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal today from a small toy wholesaler, where they were pointing out that they cannot get the custom-made, small quantity, hand-assembled toys that they sell in the United States. There is no one producing those. There's no one who plans on producing those. And because of that, they've had to lay off folks from their company. They've essentially had to, this is small business. They're barely scraping by right now, and they have been planning on retiring actually this year if things had went well. And so that's where I sort of scratch my head a little bit on these things. In general, we haven't seen much positive effect, really. I think, if anything, more net negatives. Of course, you'll find little pockets of, yes, this little fabricated metal producer is now protected. They may be adding a few jobs. But on the other hand, even in my home state in Michigan, auto parts suppliers have let go 3,500 people compared to where we were at last year. And so, this year, 2026, I think we're going to start seeing more of the full effects of these policies in place, especially on the sort of price pass-through side. Especially, I think, the first sort of 6 months of this year, we're really going to get a sense of the extent that importers feel comfortable passing on their higher costs, and also the sense that domestic manufacturers, because they're being tariffed on inputs, are going to have to pass along higher costs as well to buyers.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to watch for sure. And obviously, I kid a little bit here. Just going to mixing it up a little bit. I want to go back to how you introduce yourself in terms of things like you're looking at and analyzing things that you did not see, at least not frequently, in this space. There's a lot of economists that are involved in this space. What was specifically that you weren't seeing that you now see is pretty critical to understanding what's happening in the freight market that is kind of driving your research and analysis?
Yeah, so I'd say, for example, if you look back several years ago, there was always discussion in trucking about how much of this was consumer spending driven. And increasingly, I think today you see much more emphasis on what's going on with the domestic manufacturing side of the economy, especially certain freight-centric industries, and as well as, I'm going to say, increased emphasis we see on single-family housing activity and things of that sort, and maybe a little bit less emphasis on, let's say, the containerized import piece. Because so much of the narrative, for example, in 2021 and 2022 as well, it's all about the containerized imports being so strong. But if you look in 2024, we had very sharp growth of containerized imports, but it was still a very weak market. And so I think that we've seen, as time has went on, sort of a little bit further understanding of maybe the demand side of the industry. Also, if you go back a decade ago, I think we're seeing a lot more discussion today when the BLS releases their payroll numbers and things like that. The major media outlets will now all cover, hey, here's what the BLS's jobs data is saying for trucking, the subsectors of trucking, warehousing, etc. If I look back a decade ago, those data, didn't see as much attention. But I think we've come to realize that they're one of our better, near real-time indicators of where supply is at in the sector.
Yeah, and some of your data, at least recently, I think maybe through a post, LinkedIn, suggests job growth was overstated in 2025. What do you think that means for trucking demand? What should we be prepared for?
And so I think the big thing is when this, we're getting our annual revisions upcoming for the job data. And I think the big thing for trucking is what we're going to find is we actually had much less capacity in the industry in early 2025 than we thought we had. And when you look at the trajectory that the population level administrative records were showing, it was showing steady capacity bleed out through 2025. The other data that we had from the Bureau of Labor Statistics suggested capacity was flat. And so I think that what we'll see essentially emerge once we get the updated and benchmark data is a much clearer picture that we were having steady capacity bleed out all through 2025. And that's even before any potential incremental effects for regulatory enforcement. On the other hand, freight demand was neutral, maybe slightly up, maybe slightly down in 25 compared to 24, especially the back half of the year. I would say probably up about 1% or so, though. And so if you've got capacity bleeding out more just organically, and then you have on top of that a little bit more freight demand, you're going to get the tighter market that we see today. But it may not be a tighter market so much due to regulatory enforcement, which is one theory out there. It may just be due to the fact demand's been growing, capacity was shrinking, and it's more just a narrative of, call it organic and kind of more normal supply-demand dynamics at work.
Yeah, and I think for those watching, and there's a lot of us that pay attention, one thing I appreciate about your work, you're always very diligent about context. Like when people put out certain things, you're like, hey, but like let's don't take that out of context. And there's some good debate. I think that's good for our industry. Like I think you, Craig Fuller, y'all go back and forth a little bit here or there, specifically on that supply and demand issue. So where are the issues where presently, I mean it's an evolving issue, but presently where do you see some of your viewpoints being different from some of our other voices in the industry, whether it's Fuller or some of the other economists in our space?
Yeah, so I think kind of the key ones are, one, there's been this rush to attribute the tightness that we've experienced in December, January, and February to regulatory enforcement of English language proficiency and then non-domiciled CDLs. My statement is that could very well be the case. But let's not just also rule out the possibility that since we know capacity was exiting in 2025 at a fairly rapid pace, that this could just be the fact that we've had, freight conditions down certainly since Q3 of 22 up until really about November of 25, is that you've just had too much capacity bleed out and the market's tightened. We've then had it's been a terrible winter here in Michigan. I think, we had a horrendous winter storm in Fern that, blanketed half of the country with snow and ice. And so part of my big thing is I'm an inherently very conservative person, because if I'm thinking about being a carrier heading to a Q1 RFQ right now, yes, spot rates may be up substantially year over year. But if you go into a Q1 RFQ and put out, hey, I want 7% higher contract rates, I guarantee you're going to lose all that business, because there's no shipper in the country right now that's going to accept 7% higher year over year contract rates. You may get 2, 3, 4 right now, but shippers were not expecting a spot market to tighten as much as it has. But that also doesn't mean that they're expecting or they're going to be willing to pay that much more for contract rates. Now, if it's mid-June and the market's still really tight, then yes, they may be willing to pay that 5 to 7% more. And so I think part of my attitude is caution inherently is better if a market's turning up, because the last thing you want to be is being too aggressive and potentially losing business, especially when we've got a clear, credible alternative explanation that we saw too much capacity bleed out in 25. We've had terrible winter weather, some odd seasonal demand spikes, then with the Super Bowl, Valentine's Day, etc. On the demand side, so my view is as well is that I do not see a sustained long, call it 12-month upward pricing cycle taking place unless demand improves significantly. We just have not seen enough indicators yet of the sectors that we need to see more freight generation activity. We just haven't seen enough evidence of that yet. We did get some good January Purchasing Manager Index data from various sources, but we need to see where's housing activity at. We need to see where hydraulic fracturing's at to get a better sense. And so I think part of the caution that I always have is, as a statistician, is I don't tend to read too much into, let's say, 1 month of data, because I could just imagine if it's early March and we get negative February PMI data, people are now going to be saying, oh, the recovery. It's like, no, it could just be things just kind of smoothing out and regression to the mean type of situation. And so to me, I'm inherently very cautious. I'm not focused on being the first one to call the turn. I would rather not call the turn until I can feel very confident that it's going to be right. Because if we're calling it now in early March versus in early February, not that much is being lost right now. Like, this isn't the stock market where being off by a day can matter immensely.
Yeah, I think in our world, I think where our worlds kind of intersect on the M&A side, there's so many folks that have barely survived, especially kind of on the high spot exposure. Every quarter, this is when it's going to turn. This is when it's going to turn, and it just hasn't happened. Consequently, they've exhausted their operational reserves, and so now they're kind of looking for the crystal ball to say, like, do I continue to put more money in the pot that I can't afford to lose in this situation? Because there's a lot of different capital decisions that have come up. Maybe they have equipment replacement cycles. There's a host of different things that are fairly urgent. And so what would be your advice from a stewardship standpoint? I mean, they're trying to be realist, but at the same time, they got to make moves one way or the other. And so what advice would you give to those folks that are in a very difficult spot, attuned to the market realities and trying to make their next best move?
So I'd say there's no doubt we're entering 26 with rates getting a higher base than they were at in 25. There is no doubt of that. The question is going to be how much higher. On the spot side, C.H. Robinson, I have tremendous respect for their forecasting ability. A couple weeks ago, they were saying, about 8% higher year over year, a little bit weaker in the front half, stronger in the back half. It seemed like a very reasonable number. So I'd say spot rates, we're probably being up maybe 10% year over year. I think right now we're in a little bit of an aberration period with the extreme weather that we've had. On the contract side, that probably is going to translate over to 3 to 5% for the entire year. Mm-hmm. Again, a little bit weaker the first half of the year because shippers were not entering 2026 budgeting up 5% on truckload rates. Talking to a few of them when I was even doing executive education sessions here at Michigan State, and I was saying, look, from a budgeting standpoint this year, it would not hurt to make sure that you are potentially 5 to 7% higher. And folks looked at me like horns were growing out of my head, saying we're not planning on budgeting 5 to 7% higher for trucking rates. It's like, well, you may have that happen depending on the unique circumstances that hit this year, because there is a very bullish case that one could make to say spot rates go up 20%, contract rates go up 10%. Now that's everything has to go right. I could make you a bearish case to say this is an aberration and the whole economy will be in a recession within 9 months and we can forget about this conversation. that's again a bearish case. Probably somewhere in the middle is where you need to be. Again, I think that's where spot up, probably 8 to 10% year over year, pulls contract up, 3 to 5% for the entire year. If that, and the question then is, what are you looking at for your OPEX? What are you looking at for your labor cost? Are you looking at those going up by a similar amount or not? One of the challenges that we are going to face this year is more expensive truck parts, more expensive maintenance, and oil can't really get cheaper than what it is right now. We're kind of at a low end on the oil side. And so because of that, you're not going to be seeing diesel getting substantially cheaper. So if anything, last year, we at least for many carriers had a little bit of a tailwind and the diesel prices were down a little bit. This year, it's going to be hard to see a scenario where diesel prices get down given how low they were last year throughout the year.
Yeah. To what degree do you think shippers are attuned to the anger and frustration of truckload carriers, especially for those that have done the right things, that have operated above board, and have been effectively operating below? I mean, they've been doing runs below operating costs for 12, 18 months or longer. This is anecdotal, but I've probably talked to a dozen different, truckload carriers between that 50 to 250 million in top line revenue. And they're, very upset. And so when they get any leverage at all, they are going to make their case aggressively about what they want and what they need. And I'm interested, does that have any effect if there's an unorganized, but a collective force to go demand these rates? Does that affect anything? Do shippers respond to that, or are they a little bit more savvy and can hold a line?
So what I would say is for most shippers, it's critical for truckload carriers to realize that trucking cost is a small fraction of the overall value of the shipments. For food manufacturers, we usually use the rule of thumb, it's about 5%, give or take. For a machinery shipper, you're looking at, going and dry van for high-end machinery, you're looking at 2 to 3%. Now, I hate to say it, but they want coverage. They also, though, do have a budget. They have CFOs to talk to. None of their CFOs are going to accept that 10% rate increases right now. Not on 1.5 months or 2 months of potentially seasonal and weather-induced, rate increases. I think that, the big thing that shippers do start seeing is routing guide failure. So I do think that that's one where a lot of transportation managers, given that we just don't have evidence yet the market flipped, if they have the option of a carrier that gives them a 6% contract rate increase or one that gives them 2%, they're going to go with the 2%, and they're going to see what the routing guide does. I've talked to at least one other entity where they just went through an RFQ and rates basically came in flat, but they are budgeting that, hey, we know we may have to go up in the second half of the year, but we'll see what happens. It's all going to be a function of what the routing guide does. And so it's not for carriers to say that your shippers don't care, but they're looking at this just like any other expenditure. And right now, if you're making machinery, you're far more worried about the fact that, aluminum is 25% more expensive, or, sensors and things like that are 10% more expensive. That's where the concern more is in that direct bill of materials than, what would often get lumped in sort of the indirect spend with transportation being in that bucket. So I think collectively expressing those views, it doesn't hurt, but at the same time, we all know how these reverse auctions work, right? It's going to be lowest bidder wins most likely. Maybe you get some advantage of incumbency, but, shippers are still, they're worried about a lot of cost push price increases that they're dealing with, so they're not very sympathetic. It's kind of like 2022, where everybody's costs were going up and there wasn't maybe as much sympathy. The market dynamics allowed contract rates to go up at the start of the year, and then they plunged down in the back half of the year when the market flipped.
Yeah, we had many conversations like that around that with our M&A clients, and there was this dilemma: do I put the screws to my clients, full well knowing they're going to do the same to me when there's a correction in the market? And so there's always that tension. But I don't think anybody believed that we would be, that it would be this much lopsided for this long. So, but anyhow, let me transition the conversation a little bit. I'm interested. What are you studying right now in the freight market, or in adjacent markets that you're not, publicizing or posting about in LinkedIn that you're really interested in?
Yeah, so a lot of my research really has to tie into how does asset ownership between, having leased owner operators versus company-owned equipment, how does that affect different aspects of safety? How did that, for example, interact with the electronic logging device mandate? So as an example, from some research that's currently under revision, we found that carriers that had leased owner operators were far more responsive to the ELD mandate than the ones with employee drivers, which makes good sense because the leased owner operators were not running with e-logs prior to them being required. But that effect really showed up only for the largest of carriers. Small carriers, it really didn't matter whether it was an employee drivers or leased owner operators. Still substantial declines in ELD or in HOS violations. For the large carriers with employees, they're not basically unaffected. If anything, maybe some of them that were running AOBRs that were grandfathered, and then once those grandfathered AOBRs got wiped out in 19 at the end, they actually saw higher violation rates. Looking at things like that, looking at how maintenance differs as a function of sort of that joint combination of carrier size and use of subcontractors or employee drivers. And so that's one as an example. For the largest of carriers, company-owned equipment is better maintained. Far fewer violations in terms of maintenance. But for the smallest of carriers, it flips. It's actually the least, carriers with 2 to 6 trucks, there's fewer maintenance violations if it's leased owner-operator equipment versus equipment driven by employee drivers. And makes sense. The mega carriers with employees, they've got their own maintenance. They've got very strong incentives to make sure this stuff doesn't get caught in violation. Mm-hmm. That carrier incentive doesn't really exist when you're at the 2 to 6 truck power unit. You're just trying to survive at that point. But the leased owner operator, hey, they're taking that truck with them versus that employee driver really doesn't care. Yeah. And so for me, that's where a lot of my sort of peer-reviewed research is at right now, is trying to better understand some of these dynamics because we're really, from a research side, kind of still in the opening phases of really unpacking motor carrier safety, given all the data that we have available.
Yeah. I'm interested in the whole the discipline of just the research that you're involved in. I mean, some research is done to kind of confirm a thesis, and some of it is, maybe starts out with a thesis and then it evolves into something totally different. I'm curious, how often do you begin diving in some of this research or whatever it is, and you are surprised by what the data ultimately tells you?
So it will depend. Some of it we've got a very good sense going in what it'll be. Other times, you let the data a little bit more speak to itself, and you find something, you say, aha, okay, if what I think is causing this would be true, this other thing should happen. Let me go check this. Oh, that happens. Okay, well, this other thing should be true. And so you basically what we call pattern match. That once you find 3 or 4 things that all have sort of the same common cause, it's like, okay, this is probably what's going on here. So it's kind of a mix. In a lot of cases, especially working with trade data and things like that, we don't even really know going in what's going to be our exact unit of analysis. Are we going to study this at the HTS 10 category, the most detailed granular level? Then you start finding out, okay, wait, there's a lot of lumpiness to the data. Maybe we need to aggregate up. Okay, maybe we need to not look at every country in Asia. We're going to look at China versus the Asian nations versus Japan, etc. And so in a lot of cases, we literally, as we go, we start to figure out, okay, this is the best way to look at this topic. And then through the revision process that our papers all go through, it's very common that you'll be asked to redo analyses, find new data, completely apply sort of a different way of looking at the problem, and you'll end up changing the paper entirely. So I've had studies that what we started with and what we ended with were maybe one paragraph out of a 35-page essay was the same thing.
Yeah, I can imagine, and it's clear. I mean, I think as a, as a feedback for those that kind of follow what you're doing, you can kind of see that pattern that discipline that you're doing. Because you kind of talk about it. You say, I did this, went and checked this, and if that was true, then we'd see it over here. So I think it's helpful for the rest of the market to kind of see that in practice, so that they can use the data in some way, try to help themselves. I'm curious. You being in academia, you're doing this research. Are you in the classroom, or is it strictly research what you're doing?
So I teach about 9 credit hours a year. So Michigan State being a Research One university, most of our time and energy is expected to be spent doing research. So I teach a little bit, but I'd say of my academic time allocation, I probably allocate at least four times more time to research compared to teaching.
I think I had a few of professors just like you in college, and so, it's
the name of the game. When they say publish or perish, they're not kidding.
Well, what do you hope that your students that have access to your research, what do you hope that they learn as students that are trying to figure out their way into some profession? What do you hope they learn, whether they're supply chain students or general business students? What do you hope they learn and take forward once they get into the professional world?
Yeah, I think for me the big thing is increasingly with how I teach is just the ability to take data and be able to structure a narrative around it that is, that is solid. Whether that be if they're going to, going the consulting route, or they're going to go. We place a tremendous amount of students in sort of sourcing positions, so they go out and they're able to come in and say, okay, well, I can help inform this target cost model by going and finding XYZ piece of data. This is why this fits. This is why we want to use this. And, we were budgeting this product was going, we were doing a CapEx budget and we were planning 2% this year. And in reality, we're seeing machinery prices are going up 4.5% to 5%. We either are going to be ordering less machinery, or we need to up our budget. And so, to me, that's kind of the art that students are still going to have to be able to bring in. And also, I think increasingly is getting them comfortable working with AI, but not becoming too reliant on it, which is inherently a challenge, but that is the reality that we're also seeing. I think Anthropic certainly just scared everybody with their new updates to Claude that are essentially doing full financial analysis that would take a normal person a few days to do, and it's now going to churn it out in a matter of minutes.
Yeah, I'm seeing similar things around CRMs and some other things, yeah, super fascinating. So I'm curious, what does Jason Miller do with his time when he's not doing research and when he's not in the classroom? What are you into that's not involved in the trucking or research space?
Oh yeah, so I got 2 young kids, 9-year-old, 3-year-old. So spend a lot of time with them. Spend time at the gym. Spend time walking our gigantic Great Pyrenees that we've got. So just really kind of spending time with family. Get to the gym. Try to be decently healthy. Nothing too exciting.
I like it. All right. Well, one little last question for you, sir, which I really appreciate your insights. This is fascinating stuff. So some of our viewers don't know. They know that you teach at Michigan State. They don't know that perhaps that you're also a Buckeye as well. And so So my wild card question is, who's your favorite Ohio State athlete, football, basketball player?
I couldn't tell you. I don't even follow college sports anymore. I have never, I have always sort of torn feelings, especially about how it's moved with everything being monetized. So I don't even follow it anymore.
Well, I have another one for you then. Let's just say we get another storm. What would be what is a podcast or a book that you could recommend to our audience as they think about 2026? It could either be an escape book to kind of escape where they're at, or it could be an encouragement, something that would inspire them. What would you suggest?
Man, I don't get that much spare time for reading anymore, but
Am I striking out?
yeah, I think so. I couldn't tell you the last time I really picked up something that wasn't a kid's book to read somebody. So it's pretty much all for me, either research reading or really nothing else. Research or
All right,
kids
my final
books.
question. Here's my final one, Jason. You have an opportunity to go have lunch with another economic mind in the freight world. Craig Fuller, Tom Albrecht, Avery Vise. Who's your go-to? Go have lunch with one of those guys and compare notes.
Oh, I would probably pick. I'll take the guys at DAT. I'll pick Ken Adamo and Dean Crow. Ken, in large part, he's a fellow Buckeye. So I mean,
Oh, nice.
Gonna be biased there, but I'm gonna probably go hang out with the DAT guys.
Dean's a fellow hot seat guy. We appreciate him. He's super fun. Love his stuff.
If I would pick one group right there, I'd say that I like the FTR guys are great. As well. And Craig and I'm sure that would be a fun, good, entertaining lunch as well. So
I think we'd like to get that on the hot seat. Just run it live and see what happens. Hey, thanks so much for being in the hot seat, Jason. I really appreciate your work. Keep up what you're doing. I think it's of tremendous value to the rest of us folks here. That's going to do it for us in the hot seat. We will see you next time.